The champagne fountain sparkled as Richard Vale's empire crumbled in real time, his $23 billion deal collapsing while he smiled for investors who were already planning his funeral. Nobody noticed the black woman in a maid's uniform taking notes between collecting empty glasses. Nobody ever noticed Naomi Washington. But she'd been watching for 2 years, her finance degree gathering dust while she mopped floors and memorized every careless conversation these billionaires dropped like breadcrumbs. Tonight, as Richard's rival moved in for the kill and the board sharpened their knives, the desperate billionaire was about to learn that his cleaning lady understood hostile takeovers better than his entire team of advisors. And Naomi? She was about to prove that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one with the biggest office. It's the one everyone pretends doesn't exist. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The champagne fountain sparkled under the chandelier's light, casting golden reflections across the marble floor of Richard Vale's penthouse. Manhattan stretched out below through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights twinkling like scattered diamonds. Richard stood at the center of it all, his tailored suit worth more than most people's cars, his smile practiced and perfect as he raised his glass to the crowd. To another year of unprecedented growth, Richard announced, his voice carrying over the soft jazz quartet, and to the partnerships that will define our future. The guests applauded politely, their designer gowns and tuxedos rustling as they moved. But beneath the surface, whispers rippled through the crowd like undertow. Near the bar, 2 investors huddled close, their voices barely audible over the music. "Did you hear about the European acquisition?" one muttered, swirling his whiskey. "23 billion on the table, and Vale's betting everything on it." "Reckless," the other replied. "The man's ego is writing checks his company can't cash." Across the room, Naomi Washington moved silently between the guests, collecting empty glasses on a silver tray. Her black uniform was crisp and pressed, her movements efficient and nearly invisible. She'd learned long ago that wealthy people talked freely around service staff, as if they weren't really there at all. Their words floated past her as she worked, each conversation a piece of a larger puzzle she couldn't help but assemble in her mind. "The quarterly reports don't add up," a woman in emeralds was saying. "Richard's leveraged to the hilt. If this deal falls through..." Naomi's fingers tightened slightly on the tray. She understood exactly what that meant. Years of studying finance textbooks in her tiny apartment had taught her to read between the lines of corporate speak. Richard Vale was dancing on the edge of a cliff, and everyone here knew it except him. Or maybe he didn't know. Maybe that's why his laugh sounded just a little too loud, his gestures a little too grand. She made her way to the kitchen, depositing the glasses before returning to the main floor. The penthouse was a monument to excess. Original artwork on every wall, furniture that cost more than her annual salary, views that made you feel like you own the world. But Naomi had been cleaning these rooms for 2 years now, and she'd noticed the small changes. The Monet that used to hang in the hallway quietly sold last month. The staff reduction that Richard claimed was streamlining. The worry lines that makeup couldn't quite hide on his face. "Naomi, we need fresh champagne at the north balcony," her supervisor whispered sharply, appearing at her elbow. "Yes, ma'am," Naomi replied, keeping her voice neutral and professional. She retrieved 2 bottles from the ice, making her way through the crowd with practiced invisibility. As she passed Richard's study, the door stood slightly ajar. Inside, she could hear Richard's voice, harsh and strained, completely different from his public persona. "I don't care what the preliminary reports say, Marcus," he was saying to someone on the phone. "The Europeans need this deal as much as we do. They're bluffing." There was a pause, then Richard's voice grew harder. "No, you listen to me. I've built this empire from nothing. I know how to read a negotiation. Just because some pencil pusher in Brussels gets cold feet doesn't mean..." Another pause. Naomi heard a glass slam down on a desk. "Fine. Set up another call for tomorrow morning. And Marcus, keep this quiet. The last thing we need is the board getting spooked over nothing." Naomi moved away quickly, but not before catching a glimpse of Richard through the door crack. His shoulders were tense, his hand rubbing his temple. For just a moment, the mask had slipped completely. She continued to the balcony, where a group of younger executives were discussing market projections. As she poured champagne, her mind processed what she'd heard. The European deal wasn't just important, it was critical, and it was already showing cracks. "Did you see Victor Harland is here?" one of the executives said, nodding toward the main room. Bold of him to show his face after trying to poach 3 of Richard's top clients last quarter. Naomi's eyes found Victor easily. He was hard to miss. Where Richard was all golden confidence and broad shoulders, Victor was sharp angles and calculated movements. He stood near the windows, surrounded by his own circle of admirers, his smile like a knife edge. As if sensing her gaze, Victor looked up, his eyes sliding right past her. She was invisible to him, just part of the furniture. But she saw the way he watched Richard, like a predator studying wounded prey. The party continued for hours. Naomi refilled glasses, cleared plates, and listened. Always listening. She heard about leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers, about market volatility and regulatory challenges. Her mind filed it all away, connections forming, patterns emerging. Near midnight, as she was clearing glasses from a side table, she noticed a leather binder left behind. She glanced around. No one was watching. Quickly, she flipped it open. Financial projections, deal terms, confidential stamps on every page. Her eyes scanned rapidly, her breath catching as she realized what she was seeing. The European partners weren't just getting cold feet. They were setting Richard up. The terms had trapdoors, penalty clauses that would trigger if certain conditions weren't met. Conditions that, based on what she'd been hearing all night, were impossible to achieve. "Excuse me." Naomi's heart jumped. She closed the binder quickly, looking up to find Richard standing there. Up close, she could see the exhaustion he was hiding, the stress fractures in his perfect facade. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vale," she said quickly. "I was just clearing the table and—" "It's fine," he said, reaching for the binder. But as he picked it up, his water glass tipped, sending ice water cascading across his Italian leather shoes. "Oh!" Naomi grabbed napkins immediately, dropping to help clean the spill. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Vale. Let me—" "Leave it," he said, but his voice wasn't angry. He was looking at her with an odd expression, as if seeing her for the first time. "You're Naomi, right? You've been working here for a while." "2 years, sir," she said, standing back up. "2 years," he repeated. "And before this? Where did you work?" The question surprised her. I was in school, sir, before circumstances changed." "School for what?" She hesitated. "Business administration, with a focus on international finance." His eyebrows rose slightly. "And now you're cleaning up after parties," she finished quietly. "Life doesn't always go according to plan." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of a fellow fighter. Then the mask slipped back into place. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." He took the binder and walked away, leaving Naomi standing there with wet napkins in her hand. She watched him rejoin his guests, watched him slip back into his role of the confident billionaire. But she'd seen beneath the surface now. They both had. The party finally ended after 1 in the morning. Naomi helped clean up, her feet aching, her back sore. But her mind was racing. The trap in the European deal. Victor's predatory presence. Richard's desperate denial. It was all connected. She could feel it. Victor was the last guest to leave, making a show of shaking Richard's hand at the door. "Wonderful party, Richard," he said, his voice carrying clearly to where Naomi was collecting glasses. "Though I have to say, you look tired. Perhaps it's time to consider that retirement package we discussed. Leave the heavy lifting to those of us who still have the energy for it." "I'll rest when I'm dead, Victor," Richard replied, his smile sharp. "Which, despite your best efforts, won't be anytime soon." Victor laughed, but it was cold. "We'll see about that. Oh, and Richard, you might want to check your messages. I hear Brussels has been trying to reach you all evening. Something about restructuring the deal terms. Such a shame when partnerships fall apart at the last minute." He left with that, his footsteps echoing in the marble foyer. Naomi saw Richard's hand clench into a fist at his side, saw the way his jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone, his face paling as he read whatever was on the screen. By the time Naomi finally left the penthouse, it was nearly 3 in the morning. The subway ride to her apartment in Queens felt endless, her body exhausted, but her mind unable to rest. She climbed the 4 flights to her unit, careful not to wake the neighbors. Inside, her younger brother Marcus was asleep on the couch, his community college textbooks scattered on the coffee table. She covered him with a blanket, then went to her small bedroom. The walls were lined with business books, corporate finance, international trade, negotiation tactics. Books she'd bought secondhand, studied late into the night, dreaming of a different life. She pulled out a notebook from her desk, the one where she kept her observations from work. Not gossip, but real analysis. Pattern recognition. Market insights gleaned from overheard conversations. She began writing down everything from tonight, the pieces of the puzzle she'd collected. The European deal was collapsing. Victor knew it, had probably orchestrated it. Richard was too proud to see the trap. And somehow, she'd seen the actual terms, understood the poison pills hidden in the legal language. She looked at her notes, then at her reflection in the dark window. 28 years old, a maid in a billionaire's penthouse, with a mind that could dissect complex financial instruments, but no one who would ever listen to her. One day, she whispered to her reflection, one day, I'll be more than invisible. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. She opened it, her stomach dropping as she read the headline. Breaking. European conglomerate pulls out of Vale Enterprises deal. Stock futures plummet. It had begun. The morning sun hadn't even fully risen when Richard Vale stormed into his corporate headquarters. The building's lobby was already swarming with reporters, their cameras flashing like strobes as security held them back. Richard kept his head high, his expression controlled. But Naomi could see the truth in the television footage playing in the penthouse kitchen where she'd arrived early to clean up from last night's party. Mr. Vale, is it true the European deal has completely collapsed? Richard, what's your response to Victor Harlan's statement? Are you planning to step down? He ignored them all, disappearing into the executive elevator. Naomi watched the news coverage as she worked, her hands mechanically washing crystal while her mind raced. The financial channels were having a field day. Vale Enterprises stock had dropped 12% in pre-market trading. Turn that off, her supervisor snapped, bustling into the kitchen. Mr. Vale doesn't pay us to watch television, but he did pay them to be invisible, to blend into the background of his life. And that's exactly what Naomi did 40 minutes later when Richard burst back into the penthouse, his board of directors trailing behind him like hungry wolves. This is unacceptable, Richard. Board member William Crawford was saying, his face red with anger. You assured us this deal was solid. You said the Europeans were locked in. They were. Richard shot back, loosening his tie as he paced. This is a negotiation tactic. They'll come back to the table. With what leverage? Another board member, Patricia Thornton, slammed a folder onto the conference table. We're overextended. You borrowed against future profits from this deal to fund the Milan acquisition. If this falls through, it won't fall through. It already has. Crawford shouted. Naomi moved silently around the room, refilling water glasses, invisible to the arguing executives. But she was watching, listening, understanding. The Milan acquisition. She remembered hearing about that. Richard had bought a struggling fashion house, convinced he could turn it around. But fashion wasn't his industry. It had been an ego purchase, a trophy. And now Victor Harland is circling like a vulture, Patricia continued. My sources say he's already in talks with Brussels. He's going to steal this deal right out from under us. Let him try, Richard said, but his confidence sounded forced. He's not trying, Richard. He's doing it. Crawford pulled out his phone, showing Richard something on the screen. This went live 10 minutes ago. Naomi couldn't see the screen from where she stood, but she saw Richard's face drain of color. That's impossible. How did he get those numbers? Does it matter? He's offering them better terms, and he's not leveraged to the hilt like we are. The argument continued for another hour. Accusations flew, voices raised, furniture was nearly thrown. Through it all, Naomi remained invisible, observing the collapse of an empire in real time. By the time the board members stormed out, threatening everything from lawsuits to hostile takeovers, Richard was alone in his conference room, head in his hands. Naomi began clearing the abandoned coffee cups and water glasses. The whiteboard behind Richard was covered in financial projections, crossed out and rewritten multiple times. Her eyes traced the numbers automatically, her mind processing the mathematics. The depreciation schedule is wrong, she murmured under her breath, not realizing she'd spoken aloud. If you factor in the tax implications of the foreign holdings, the actual loss is... What did you just say? She froze. Richard had lifted his head, staring at her with an intensity that made her step back. Nothing, sir. I apologize. I was just... No. He stood up, moving toward her. What you just said about the depreciation schedule. Say it again. Naomi's heart raced. She'd been so careful for 2 years, never letting anyone see her real mind. But looking at the desperation in Richard's eyes, something made her continue. The depreciation schedule on the board, she said quietly. It's calculating based on domestic standards, but your Milan holdings fall under European tax law. The actual depreciation would be accelerated, which means your paper losses are higher than your real losses. You have more leverage than these numbers suggest. Richard stared at her for a long moment. You understand financial depreciation schedules? I studied finance. Before. Before what? Before my mother got sick. Before the medical bills. Before I had to drop out and take whatever work I could find to support my brother. The confession hung between them. Richard walked to the whiteboard, studying the numbers with new eyes. Show me, he said finally. Show me what you mean. Naomi hesitated, then picked up a marker. Her hand trembled slightly as she began writing, correcting the calculations, showing the real implications of international tax law on the holdings. Richard watched in silence as she worked, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise to something like awe. This is actually brilliant, he said. It doesn't solve everything, but it gives us breathing room. How did you? Mr. Vale, Naomi interrupted gently. There's something else. Last night, at the party, I saw Victor talking to one of your former analysts. They were discussing the supplier contracts for the Brussels deal. I don't think the Europeans pulled out on their own. I think Victor orchestrated it. Richard's jaw clenched. That's a serious accusation. I know, but the timing, the way he mentioned Brussels before the news broke, the fact that he already has a counteroffer ready, he's been planning this for months. Richard walked to his window, looking out at the city. Even if you're right, what does it matter? He's won. The deal is dead, and my company is bleeding out. Not necessarily, Naomi said, then caught herself. I'm sorry. I shouldn't. No, continue. Please. She took a breath. Victor's deal has the same fundamental flaw yours did. He's promising delivery schedules based on a supplier that's about to lose their certification. I heard some executives discussing it at a dinner 3 weeks ago. The supplier has been covering up safety violations. When that comes out, any deal dependent on them becomes toxic. Richard turned to face her fully. How could you possibly know that? Because I listen, she said simply. People talk freely when they think no one important is listening. And to them, I'm no one important. The silence stretched between them. Then Richard's phone rang, shattering the moment. He answered it, his face darkening as he listened. I see. Yes. No, I'll handle it. He hung up, his hand tied on the phone. That was CNN. They want a statement about the news that Victor Harland has formally announced his bid for the European partnership. He's calling a press conference in an hour to detail how he's going to succeed where I failed. Richard grabbed the remote, turning on the wall-mounted television. Sure enough, there was Victor on the financial news channel. Standing outside his headquarters, reporters gathered around him like disciples. Vale Enterprises has lost its way, Victor was saying, his voice smooth and confident. Richard Vale is a relic of old business, making emotional decisions instead of strategic ones. This European partnership needs fresh blood, new vision. I'm prepared to offer both. Mr. Harland, a reporter called out. What do you say to claims that you deliberately sabotaged the Vale deal? Victor smiled, the expression sharp as glass. I say that Richard Vale sabotaged himself. His ego has been writing checks his company can't cash for years. I'm simply picking up the pieces of his incompetence. Richard threw the remote against the wall, shattering it. That's sanctimonious. He stopped, remembering Naomi was there. I apologize. That was inappropriate. He's scared, Naomi said quietly. What? Victor. He's scared. That's why he's being so aggressive, so public. He needs to close this deal fast before anyone looks too closely at the details. Before anyone notices the supplier problem. Richard studied her, this woman in a maid's uniform who saw more than his entire board of directors. What's your name? He asked. Your full name. Naomi Washington. Naomi Washington, he repeated. How would you like to make more in a week than you currently make in a year? She blinked. Sir, help me, he said, the words seemingly difficult for him to speak. Help me save my company, and I'll pay you consultant fees that will change your life. Naomi's mind raced. This was insane. She was a maid. He was a billionaire. This wasn't how the world worked. But then she thought of Marcus, asleep on their couch, studying by candlelight when they couldn't afford electricity. She thought of her mother's medical bills, still haunting them from beyond the grave. She thought of all those nights studying financial theory, telling herself it would matter someday. I don't want charity, she said finally. If I help you, I want real compensation. Consultant rates. A contract. And when this is over, a recommendation letter that will actually mean something. Richard's eyebrows rose. You're negotiating with me? You need me, she said simply. We both know it. That gives me leverage. For the first time in days, Richard actually smiled. It was small, tired, but genuine. You really did study finance. Top of my class at NYU before I had to leave. All right, Ms. Washington, you have a deal. But we need to move fast. Victor's already. He was interrupted by his phone ringing again. This time, his face went pale as he listened. How many? He asked quietly. I see. No, I understand. Thank you for the courtesy of telling me directly. He hung up, sinking into a chair. That was my biggest investor. They're pulling out. Once word spreads, it'll be a run on the bank. By tomorrow morning, I won't have a company left to save. Naomi walked to the whiteboard, picking up the marker again. Then we don't have until tomorrow morning. We have tonight. One night to find Victor's weakness and exploit it. You really think we can do that? She turned to face him, and for the first time, Richard saw her. Not the uniform, not the position, but the fierce intelligence and determination that had been hiding in plain sight for 2 years. Mr. Vale, I've been invisible my entire life. I've watched people like Victor destroy people like you, and people like you ignore people like me. But right now, we need each other. You have the platform and the connections. I have the information and the perspective. Together, we might just pull off the impossible. Richard stood up, his exhaustion replaced by something new. Hope, maybe, or just desperation refined into determination. Then let's get to work. As night fell over Manhattan, an unlikely partnership was born in the ruins of a billionaire's pride. The maid who saw everything and the mogul who'd been blind to his own downfall, working together as the clock ticked toward midnight and the end of everything Richard Vale had built. But Naomi Washington had learned long ago that the best opportunities came disguised as disasters. And this disaster was about to become her greatest opportunity of all. The night stretched ahead of them like a battlefield, and Richard Vale's penthouse had transformed into a war room. Papers covered every surface, laptops hummed with data, and empty coffee cups multiplied like soldiers gathering for battle. Naomi Washington sat across from Richard at his massive dining table, her maid's uniform replaced with one of her own blazers she'd retrieved from her locker, professional but clearly inexpensive next to Richard's $1,000 shirt. Let's establish terms, Richard said, sliding a hastily drafted contract across the table. $100,000 for the week, plus a $50,000 bonus if we succeed. Naomi read it carefully, her eyes catching every detail. Add a clause about the recommendation letter. And I want it in writing that my involvement remains confidential unless I choose to disclose it. You don't want credit? Credit is a luxury I can't afford yet. Victor Harland would destroy me if he knew I was helping you. I need to stay invisible a little longer. Richard nodded, making the additions. As he wrote, Naomi spread out her own materials. Notebooks filled with observations, printed articles she'd collected, financial reports she'd memorized during countless hours of cleaning empty boardrooms. Tell me about the supplier, Richard said, signing the contract and sliding it back. Everything you know. Burned Out Manufacturing, based in Cologne, Naomi began, her voice shifting into a professor's cadence. They hold exclusive contracts for specialized components that both your deal and Victor's require. 3 weeks ago, at the Morrison charity dinner, I overheard 2 German executives discussing an upcoming regulatory review. Burnout has been falsifying safety inspections. Their certification expires in 6 days, and it won't be renewed. Richard leaned forward. 6 days. Victor's planning to sign before then. Of course he is. But here's what he doesn't know. The regulatory review can be triggered early if someone files a formal complaint with supporting evidence. Which we don't have. No, Naomi agreed. But we don't need it. We just need Victor to think we have it. She pulled out a timeline she'd drawn, marking key dates and connections. Richard studied it, his mind working through the implications. This is sophisticated analysis, he said. Where did you really learn this? You'd be surprised what you can learn with a library card and determination, Naomi replied. Plus, your office has excellent Wi-Fi. I've been taking online courses during my breaks for 2 years. Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed. Another investor pulling out. His jaw tightened, but Naomi placed a steady hand on the papers. Focus. Panic is what Victor wants. Let's use his arrogance against him. They worked through the night, Naomi teaching Richard angles he'd never considered. She showed him how to read between the lines of corporate statements, how to spot the tells in Victor's public appearances, how to think like someone who'd been underestimated their entire life. Your problem, Naomi said around 3 a.m, is that you've always fought power with power. But Victor's prepared for that. He's not prepared for subtlety. Subtlety isn't exactly my strong suit, Richard admitted, rubbing his exhausted eyes. I noticed. Remember the Whitman acquisition last year? Richard looked up sharply. How do you know about that? You screamed at your lawyers about it for 3 hours. The entire cleaning staff knows about it. She allowed herself a small smile. You tried to bulldoze Whitman, and he walked away. But if you'd noticed his wife's charity connections, you could have approached through that channel. Soft power, Mr. Vale. Sometimes it's more effective than hard power. Richard stared at her. You've been analyzing my deals? I've been learning from your mistakes. There's a difference. The honesty should have stung, but Richard found himself appreciating it. Everyone else told him what he wanted to hear. Naomi told him what he needed to hear. By dawn, they had a plan. It was risky, dependent on timing and psychology rather than brute force. Richard's assistant, James, arrived at 7, his face showing shock at finding Naomi sitting at the conference table with Richard. Sir, what is she? Ms. Washington is a consultant, Richard said firmly. She's helping with the Victor situation. James's expression turned skeptical, almost insulted. A consultant. The Maid is a consultant. The Maid just identified 3 critical flaws in Victor's strategy that you missed, Richard shot back. So yes, she's a consultant. Problem? James's face reddened. Sir, with all due respect, this is desperate. What will the board think? What will the media? The media already thinks I'm finished, Richard interrupted. The board wants to oust me. I've got nothing left to lose by trying something different. Naomi watched the exchange silently, recognizing the doubt in James's eyes. She'd seen it her whole life. The inability to believe intelligence could exist outside the expected packages. James, she said calmly, the Henderson report on your desk. Page 43 has a calculation error that understates liability by $12 million. You might want to correct that before the afternoon filing. James grabbed the report, flipping to the page. His face went pale. How did you? I clean your office every night. Sometimes I read what's left on desks. Consider it free quality control. Richard actually laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in weeks. James, I need you to set up a meeting with Davidson from the Times. Tell him I have a story about Victor he'll want to hear. Sir, talking to the media right now. is exactly what Victor won't expect. Do it. As James left, clearly rattled, Richard's lawyer, Jennifer Stevens, arrived. She took one look at Naomi and turned to Richard. Please tell me you haven't lost your mind entirely. Jennifer, meet Naomi Washington. She's going to help us save the company. Jennifer's expression was ice. The cleaning lady is going to save a multi-billion-dollar enterprise? The cleaning lady, Naomi said, standing to face her, identified the legal loophole Victor's using to circumvent the non-compete clause in your contracts. Section 47B, subsection 3. You classified the European deal as a partnership rather than an acquisition, which means the non-compete doesn't apply. Victor's lawyers found it. Yours didn't. Jennifer's mouth opened, then closed. She pulled out her phone, quickly scrolling through documents. How could you possibly? Your paralegal left the marked-up contract on the conference table 6 weeks ago. I read it while vacuuming. Richard watched Jennifer's worldview shift in real time. All right, the lawyer said slowly. What's your plan? They spent the next 3 hours refining their strategy. Naomi outlined Victor's weaknesses while Richard leveraged his remaining connections. They needed to move fast, but carefully, like defusing a bomb while running a marathon. The first test came that afternoon. Richard had to face his remaining investors, convince them not to flee. Naomi prepped him like a coach before a championship fight. Don't mention the supplier issue yet, she instructed. That's our ace. Instead, focus on the $40 million subsidiary deal with Columbia Textiles. It's small, but it's solid. Show them you can still win battles, even if the war looks lost. Columbia Textiles? The CEO's daughter goes to school with your assistant son. James mentioned it during a phone call last month. Have James reach out through that connection. Personal touches matter. Richard looked at her with something approaching awe. You really do see everything. I see what people ignore. There's a difference. The investor meeting was brutal. They sat around Richard's conference table like vultures, ready to pick the bones clean. But Richard followed Naomi's script, staying calm, focusing on small victories rather than grand promises. When Thomas Garrett, his oldest investor, started to waver, Naomi quietly slipped Richard a note. Mention his grandson's startup. Tom, Richard said smoothly, before you make any decisions, remember that my tech division is perfectly positioned to partner with your grandson's AI startup. We've been watching his work. Brilliant kid. Takes after you. Thomas's expression softened slightly. You know about Jeremy's company? Of course. We're family here, Tom. We don't abandon family at the first sign of trouble. It wasn't enough to stop the bleeding entirely, but it slowed it. 3 investors agreed to wait 72 hours before making final decisions. It was breathing room, barely, but Naomi had taught Richard that sometimes barely was enough. That evening, as Manhattan glittered outside the penthouse windows, Naomi finally allowed exhaustion to show. She sat on Richard's expensive couch, looking small and tired but somehow undefeated. You should rest, Richard said, bringing her coffee anyway. We've been at this for 20 hours straight. I can't afford to rest. Neither can you. Why are you really doing this? Richard asked, sitting across from her. It's not just about the money. Naomi was quiet for a moment. My mother was brilliant, smarter than me. She could have been anything, but she was born in the wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong color. She died believing the world had no place for people like us at tables like yours. She looked directly at Richard. I'm doing this because I need to prove her wrong. And because you need to learn she was wrong, too. Richard felt something shift in his chest, an understanding that transcended business. I've been an ass, haven't I? All these years, having someone like you right there, and I never saw it. You saw what you expected to see. Most people do. Not anymore, Richard said firmly. When this is over, let's focus on making sure there isn't after this, Naomi interrupted. Tomorrow, Victor makes his move. We need to be ready. The morning arrived with all the subtlety of a declaration of war. Victor Harland appeared on every financial news channel, standing in front of the European Union Trade Building, announcing his revolutionary partnership that would redefine international commerce. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and every word was aimed at Richard's jugular. Some leaders know when to step aside. Victor said to the cameras. Richard Vale had his time, but that time has passed. Today marks the beginning of a new era. Richard watched from his office, his hands clenched. Naomi stood beside him, taking notes on every word Victor said, every gesture he made. He's overconfident, she observed. Look at his body language. He's not even considering the possibility of failure. Maybe because he doesn't need to, Richard said bitterly. He's got everything. The momentum, the media, the money. No, Naomi corrected. He's got arrogance. And arrogance makes people sloppy. Watch, he's about to mention the supplier. Sure enough, Victor began describing the ironclad supply chain that would ensure delivery. He name-dropped burned-out manufacturing, calling them the gold standard of European industrial excellence. Naomi smiled. He just put all his chips on a losing bet. He doesn't know about the certification issue. But we can't prove it without evidence. We don't need to prove it. We just need the right person to ask the right question at the right time. She pulled out her phone. There's a German journalist, Eric Muller. He's been investigating Burndout for months. I've been feeding him anonymous tips through a secure email. Richard stared at her. You've been running intelligence operations from my penthouse. I've been protecting my investment. If you fall, I'll lose my job. I couldn't afford that, so I've been planning contingencies. For how long? 6 months. Ever since I realized Victor was targeting you. Richard sat down heavily. Why didn't you? Would you have listened to your maid 6 months ago? The truth of it stung. Richard shook his head. No, I wouldn't have. Then nothing was lost. But now you're listening, and that changes everything. She showed Richard the email thread with the journalist, careful to keep her identity hidden even from him. Muller is hungry for this story. One phone call from someone credible asking about Burndout certification, and he'll run with it. Someone credible rules me out. Victor's painted me as desperate. Not you, Naomi agreed. But what about Margaret Fuller, the SEC commissioner? Your ex-wife's college roommate. They still have lunch monthly. A casual question from her would spark everything. Richard's expression was complicated. You're suggesting I call my ex-wife and ask for help. I'm suggesting you swallow your pride to save your company. Your choice. The call to his ex-wife, Catherine, was perhaps the most painful thing Richard had done in years. Naomi listened as he humbled himself, admitted his mistakes, asked for help. Catherine was cold at first, but something in Richard's genuine desperation must have reached her. One call. Catherine finally agreed. I'll have Margaret ask about Burnt. But Richard, this is the last favor. Ever. Understood. And Catherine, thank you. After he hung up, Richard looked drained. She used to love me, you know, before I became this. You're becoming something else now, Naomi said gently. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find out who you really are. The afternoon brought the next phase of their plan. Naomi had identified a crucial weakness in Victor's investor coalition. Several of them had exposure to markets that would be disrupted if Burnout failed. They needed to plant doubt without seeming desperate. You can't approach them directly, Naomi explained. But Eleanor Hastings can. My board member? She hates me right now. No, she hates losing money. There's a difference. She also has connections Victor doesn't know about. Her nephew works for Burndot's primary competitor. If she suddenly started asking questions about certification processes, Richard made the call, appealing to Eleanor's business instincts rather than loyalty. It was a delicate dance, but Naomi had scripted every word. Just wondering, Eleanor, Richard said casually, have you heard anything about regulatory changes in German manufacturing? My sources suggest something's brewing. Eleanor was suspicious but intrigued. What kind of sources? The kind that have made me very wealthy over the years. Do what you will with the information. As evening approached, the first crack appeared in Victor's armor. The German journalist published a questioning piece about Burndout's safety record. It wasn't conclusive, but it raised questions. Financial Twitter began buzzing. Victor's stock price dipped 2%. It's working, Richard said, watching the numbers. It's just beginning, Naomi corrected. Victor will counterattack. We need to be ready. Sure enough, within an hour, Victor was on television again, dismissing the desperate fake news planted by a failing competitor. He announced that the signing ceremony would be moved up to tomorrow afternoon, before any manufactured scandals could interfere. He's accelerating, Naomi observed. That's fear. Or confidence. No. Watch his hands. He's fidgeting. He knows something's wrong, but can't identify what. He's trying to close before we can fully execute. Richard's phone rang. It was Davidson from the Times. Richard, I'm hearing interesting whispers about Bernda. Care to comment? On the record? No. Off the record? You might want to have someone in Brussels tomorrow. Just a suggestion from an old friend. You're playing a dangerous game? Richard. I'm playing the only game left to me. That night, Naomi and Richard worked until dawn again, preparing for the final confrontation. They had one shot at this, one moment when all the pieces would align. If they missed it, everything would collapse. You need to be at the signing, Naomi said. Your presence will rattle Victor. I wasn't invited. Since when has that stopped, Richard Vale? He smiled grimly. Point taken. But what about you? I'll be where I always am. Invisible, but watching everything. As the sun rose over Manhattan, Naomi finally went home to change and check on Marcus. Her brother was awake, worried. You haven't been home in 2 days, he said. What's going on? I'm fixing something, she said, hugging him. Something important. For who? For us. For everyone who's been told they don't belong at the table. She returned to the penthouse to find Richard in his best suit, looking like a warrior preparing for battle. But there was something different about him now. The arrogance had been tempered by humility, the blindness replaced by sight. Whatever happens today, he said to Naomi, I want you to know something. You've taught me more in 3 days than I learned in 30 years of business. You were a good student, she replied. Eventually, if this works, everything changes. You know that, right? You won't be invisible anymore. I know, Naomi said quietly. I'm ready for that. Richard headed for the door, then paused. The supplier certification expires in 3 days, right? Yes. And Victor doesn't know. He's about to find out. Richard nodded, straightening his tie. Then let's go ruin his day. As Richard left for the signing ceremony, Naomi took her position in his office, multiple screens open, phones ready, her network of connections primed. She might be invisible, but she was about to show everyone that invisible didn't mean powerless. The ceremony was being held at the St. Regis Hotel, a temple to old money and established power. Media from around the world had gathered. Victor stood at the podium like a conquering hero, the European partners beside him, victory seemingly assured. Then Richard Vale walked in. The room erupted in whispers. Security moved to intercept him, but Richard held up an invitation. Naomi had discovered that the hotel's event coordinator owed Richard a favor from years ago. One phone call had secured entry. Just here to witness history, Richard said, loudly enough for the microphones to catch. Don't mind me. Victor's jaw tightened, but he maintained his smile. How appropriate that you're here to see the future of business being written, Richard. Perhaps you'll learn something. Oh, I've been learning a lot lately, Richard replied, taking a seat in the front row. Amazing what you can discover when you start paying attention to the right people. Victor turned back to the podium, beginning his speech about innovation and progress. But Richard's presence had changed the energy in the room. Reporters were texting furiously. The European partners looked uncomfortable. Then, right as Victor was about to sign, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. Erich Muller, the German journalist, had arrived with a camera crew. Mr. Harland, he called out, can you comment on the news that Burned Out Manufacturing is under investigation for safety violations? That their certification is being revoked? The room exploded. Victor's face went white. The European partners stepped back from the signing table, demanding answers. Phones rang everywhere as investors and reporters scrambled for information. This is ridiculous, Victor stammered. Baseless accusations. Actually, Richard said, standing up, his voice carrying over the chaos. It's due diligence. Something you might have done if you weren't so eager to steal my deal. He pulled out his phone, showing a document Naomi had sent him moments ago. Burndout's certification expires in 3 days. Without them, your supply chain collapses. The entire deal becomes worthless. The European partners were already leaving, their lawyers huddled in urgent conversation. Victor stood at the podium, his moment of triumph transformed into utter humiliation. "You did this," he snarled at Richard. "You planted this story." "I didn't have to plant anything," Richard replied calmly. "The truth has a way of surfacing. You just have to know where to look. Or better yet, you have to know who to listen to." As Victor's deal collapsed in real time, broadcast to the world, Richard walked out of the hotel. He called Naomi immediately. "It worked," he said simply. "Of course it worked," she replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I told you, invisible doesn't mean powerless. You're not invisible anymore, Naomi. Not to me. Not to anyone who matters." Back in his penthouse, Naomi stood at the window, looking out at the city that had ignored her for so long. Her phone buzzed with messages from journalists who'd figured out someone had orchestrated Victor's downfall. The invisible Maid was about to step into the light. But first, she had a company to help rebuild. And this time, she wouldn't be doing it from the shadows. The aftermath of Victor's collapse at the St. Regis hit like a tsunami. Within hours, every financial outlet, social media platform, and gossip blog was dissecting the spectacular failure. But as Richard Vale sat in his penthouse watching the coverage, he realized the narrative was taking an unexpected turn. Billionaire's Hail Mary. Richard Vale relies on cleaning lady to save empire, read the Business Insider headline. The accompanying photo showed Naomi in her maid's uniform, a file photo someone had dug up from the building security company. Richard's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Board members, investors, reporters, everyone wanted to know if it was true. Had the great Richard Vale really been saved by his maid? "Turn it off," Naomi said quietly from beside him. She'd been monitoring the coverage on her laptop, watching her anonymity evaporate in real time. "They're mocking you," Richard said, anger building in his voice. "This is wrong. You're brilliant, and they're reducing you to what I am," Naomi interrupted. "A maid who noticed things." "That's not an insult, Mr. Vale. It's the truth." Before Richard could respond, James burst in, his face flushed with panic. "Sir, it's worse than we thought. Someone leaked internal emails showing you've been working with Ms. Washington. They're calling her the cleaning lady CFO. Twitter is having a field day." Richard grabbed James's tablet, scrolling through the social media storm. Memes were already spreading. Photos of mops with MBA degrees, jokes about janitor consultants, cruel commentaries about desperation. His jaw clenched tighter with each post. "How do they find out?" he demanded. "Victor," Naomi said simply. "This is his counterstrike. He can't attack the facts, so he's attacking the credibility, making you look desperate and me look like a joke." Richard's phone rang. It was William Crawford from the board. "Richard, please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." Crawford's voice was ice. "The Wall Street Journal is running a story saying you've been taking financial advice from domestic staff." "I've been taking financial advice from a brilliant analyst who happens to work as domestic staff," Richard corrected. "For God's sake, Richard, do you have any idea how this looks? We're already hemorrhaging credibility, and now this." "The other board members are calling an emergency meeting. They want you out." "Then they're idiots," Richard snapped. "Naomi Washington saw what none of you could see. She saved this company. She's made us a laughingstock. The stock price is in free fall. Investors are running for the exits. Fix this, Richard, or you're done." Crawford hung up. Richard threw his phone against the wall, shattering it. "This is my fault," he said, turning to Naomi. "I should have protected you better. Should have controlled the narrative." "You can't control how the world sees me," Naomi said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "I knew this would happen. A black woman claiming expertise in a white man's world? They were always going to try to diminish me. So we fight back. We go on every show, every podcast." "No." Naomi stood, walking to the window. "That's your instinct, to fight power with power. But that won't work here. The more you defend me, the more desperate you look. The more I defend myself, the more they'll say I'm uppity, aggressive, forgetting my place. Then what do we do?" Naomi's phone buzzed. It was Marcus, texting frantically. Reporters were at their apartment building, harassing neighbors, trying to get dirt on his sister. Someone had even approached him at school, offering money for embarrassing stories. "I have to go," Naomi said, grabbing her things. My brother needs me. Naomi, wait. But she was already at the elevator. You should distance yourself from me, Mr. Vale. It's the smart play. Blame the desperate decision on stress. Bring in a traditional consultant. Rebuild your credibility. That's not happening. She looked at him, seeing something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Not pity, not guilt, but genuine respect and determination. Then you're about to lose everything, she said softly. And this time, I can't save you. The elevator doors closed, leaving Richard alone in his penthouse, surrounded by screens showing his humiliation. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about his own reputation. He cared about the injustice being done to someone who deserved better. Naomi's apartment building was surrounded by photographers when she arrived. They shouted questions, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in her face. Naomi, is it true you've been manipulating Richard Vale? How long have you been planning this? What makes you think you're qualified to advise billionaires? She pushed through them, saying nothing, her face a mask of calm despite the storm inside. But one reporter's question stopped her cold. Ms. Washington, what would your deceased mother think about you pretending to be something you're not? Naomi turned slowly, looking directly at the reporter. For a moment, the crowd quieted, sensing something shifting. My mother, Naomi said clearly, would be proud that I used my mind to help save thousands of jobs. She would be proud that I didn't let anyone's expectations limit me. And she would be ashamed of anyone who thinks a person's worth is determined by their job title rather than their capabilities. She went inside, leaving the reporters momentarily speechless. But she knew it wouldn't be enough. The narrative was already set. Inside, Marcus was pacing, scared and angry. Naomi, they're saying horrible things about you online. About us. About Mom. I know, she said, hugging him. I'm sorry. I never wanted this to touch you. Someone from school posted that old eviction notice from when Mom was sick. They're saying we're grifters, that you're some kind of con artist. Naomi felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. Let them say what they want. We know the truth. The truth doesn't matter if no one believes it. Her phone rang. It was Eleanor Hastings from Richard's board. Ms. Washington, I'm calling personally to say I'm impressed by what you accomplished. That analysis of Burned was masterful. Thank you, but, however, Eleanor continued, perception is reality in business. Your continued involvement is hurting Richard's ability to recover. I'm offering you a different arrangement. $500,000 to sign an NDA and disappear. Let's bring in a traditional firm to take credit for the turnaround strategy. You get paid, Richard survives, everyone wins. Everyone except the truth, Naomi said. The truth is a luxury none of us can afford right now. Think about it. You have 24 hours. After Eleanor hung up, Naomi sat in her small kitchen, staring at bills she couldn't pay, thinking about Marcus's college tuition, their mother's remaining medical debt. $500,000 would solve everything. All she had to do was disappear, let someone else take credit for her work. It wouldn't be the first time. It probably wouldn't be the last. Her laptop chimed. An email from Eric Muller, the German journalist. Ms. Washington, I know you're the source who's been feeding me information about Burned. Your analysis has been exceptional. I'd like to interview you on record, tell your side of the story. The world should know the truth about who really saved Vale Enterprises. She closed the laptop without responding. The truth. Everyone claimed to want it, but nobody wanted to deal with its implications. Meanwhile, Richard was facing his own crisis. The emergency board meeting was brutal, with members demanding his immediate resignation. You've made us a joke, Patricia Thornton said. The cleaning lady strategist? Really? What's next? The doorman doing our taxes. That cleaning lady has more financial acumen than anyone in this room, Richard shot back. Then why was she cleaning toilets? Crawford demanded. If she's so brilliant, why wasn't she at Goldman Sachs? Because the world isn't fair, Richard said. Because people like you can't see past their prejudices to recognize brilliance when it's standing right in front of you. Spare us the social justice lecture, Patricia said. This is business, and business requires credibility, which you've destroyed. I've got 48 hours to turn this around, Richard said. If I can't, I'll resign. But I'm not abandoning Naomi Washington. She saved this company, whether you want to admit it or not. After the meeting, Richard found himself alone in his office, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. His phone, a replacement for the one he'd broken, rang. It was Victor Harland. "Enjoying the show, Richard?" Victor's voice was smug, satisfied. "I have to hand it to you. Using the Maid was creative. Desperate and pathetic, but creative. What do you want, Victor?" "To offer you a way out. Publicly admit the whole thing was a hoax, that you fed information to the Maid to make it seem like she was the genius. Take full credit, throw her under the bus, and I'll call off my media dogs. Go to hell. Your funeral. But remember, it's not just you going down. That poor woman is being torn apart because of your pride. Her brother's being harassed at school. Her dead mother's memory is being dragged through the mud. All because you couldn't admit defeat gracefully." Victor hung up, leaving Richard with the weight of his words. Was his refusal to abandon Naomi actually hurting her more? That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She sat at her window, looking out at the city, wondering if her mother had been right all along. Maybe there really wasn't a place for people like them at those tables. Maybe she should take Eleanor's money and disappear. Her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. "Don't give up. Please." She stared at the message, then typed back. "Why do you care?" His response came quickly. "Because you're the first person in 30 years who told me the truth. Because you saw me at my worst and still helped. Because you deserve better than this. The world doesn't care what I deserve. Then we make them care. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Trust me." Naomi stared at the message, uncertain. Trust. Such a fragile thing, especially from someone like Richard Vale. But something in her, maybe hope or maybe just exhaustion, made her type, "Okay." The next afternoon, Naomi arrived at Richard's penthouse to find it transformed into a television studio. Professional lighting, multiple cameras, and a familiar face, Patricia Chun from Bloomberg News, one of the most respected financial journalists in the country. "What is this?" Naomi asked Richard. "A debate," he replied. "Victor agreed to it this morning. He thinks he's going to publicly humiliate both of us, finish what he started. But I have a different plan. Mr. Vale, I can't go on television. I'm not. Not what? Not polished enough? Not credentialed enough? Naomi, you're the smartest person I've ever met. It's time the world sees what I see." Patricia Chin approached them. "Ms. Washington, Mr. Vale, we go live in 30 minutes. The format is simple. A discussion about the burnout situation, the European deal, and the role you played in uncovering the truth. Victor Harland will join us remotely from his office." Naomi's hands were shaking. "I don't do public speaking. I observe, I analyze, but I don't." "You spoke truth to those reporters yesterday," Richard reminded her. "You spoke truth to me when I needed to hear it. Now, speak it to the world." A makeup artist approached, but Naomi waved her off. "No, if I do this, I do it as myself. Not some polished version they want to see." Richard smiled. "That's the Naomi Washington I know." As they took their seats, Naomi's mind raced. This was Victor's arena, the world of public performance and media manipulation. She was a maid who'd learned finance from library books and YouTube videos. What was she doing here? The cameras went live. Patricia Chin's introduction was brutal in its efficiency, laying out the controversy, the mockery, the questions about Richard's judgment and Naomi's qualifications. "Mr. Harland," Patricia said, turning to the screen where Victor appeared, sitting in his pristine office. "You've called this situation the most desperate move in corporate history. Care to elaborate?" Victor's smile was predatory. "Patricia, what we have here is a failing CEO who is so desperate to save face that he concocted a story about his maid being some kind of secret genius. It's insulting to real financial professionals who spent years earning their credentials." "Ms. Washington," Patricia turned to Naomi. "How do you respond to accusations that you're simply a prop in Mr. Vale's attempt to save his company?" Naomi felt the weight of the cameras, the millions of people watching. She thought of her mother, of Marcus, of every time she'd been overlooked and underestimated. "I respond with facts," Naomi said, her voice gaining strength. "On March 15th, at 3:47 p.m., Mr. Harlan's company initiated a series of shell transactions through 3 subsidiaries in Luxembourg. The purpose was to hide the dependency on burned-out manufacturing from regulatory scrutiny. I have the transaction numbers if you'd like them. Victor's smile faltered slightly. That's ridiculous. You can't possibly. Transaction A4473. B. Routed through Harlan's subsidiary Apex Holdings. Transaction A4489. C. Masked as a consulting fee to Brandenburg Associates, which doesn't actually exist except on paper. Should I continue? The studio was silent. Patricia Chun leaned forward. How do you know this? Because I pay attention, Naomi said simply. While serving coffee at the Morrison charity dinner, I heard Mr. Harlan's CFO discussing the Luxembourg structure with a colleague. While cleaning the conference room at Vale Enterprises, I saw the reflection of his laptop screen in the window. He'd forgotten to close his email, which contained the routing numbers. While taking out trash, I noticed shredded documents that hadn't been properly destroyed and pieced together enough to understand the pattern. You went through garbage? Victor said, trying to sound dismissive, but there was panic in his eyes now. I did my job thoroughly, just like I've always done. The difference is this time, someone bothered to listen to what I found. Richard spoke up. The real question, Victor, is why you needed such an elaborate structure to hide a simple supplier relationship. Unless you knew about the certification issues months ago. That's libel. It's deduction, Naomi interrupted. The shell structure was created in January, 2 months before you announced interest in a European deal. The only reason to hide burned that early would be if you knew their certification was at risk. You were planning to push the deal through before anyone noticed, leaving the European partners holding a worthless agreement. Patricia Chun pulled up documents on her tablet. Mr. Harlan, would you care to respond to these specific allegations? Victor's face was red now, his composure cracking. This is absurd. We're supposed to believe that a maid, a janitor, understood complex international finance better than teams of analysts. Yes, Naomi said quietly, because those teams of analysts were looking where you wanted them to look. I was looking where you didn't think anyone would bother. She pulled out a folder she'd brought, laying out document after document. Here's the pattern of Victor's acquisitions over 5 years. Every single one followed the same model. Identify a company with a hidden flaw, orchestrate a crisis, sweep in as the savior, then strip the assets. He tried to do it to Vale Enterprises, but he didn't count on someone like me being in the room. Someone like you, Victor sneered. A nobody, a nothing. The words hung in the air. Naomi felt their sting, but also their power. Because Victor had just shown his true face to millions of viewers. A nobody who exposed your fraud, she said calmly. A nothing who saw what you really are. Mr. Harlan, you're so used to people like me being invisible that you forgot we have eyes. We have minds. And sometimes we have the courage to speak up. Richard leaned forward. Victor, you made one critical mistake. You assumed that brilliance only comes from ivory towers and corner offices. You never considered that someone who'd fought for every opportunity, who'd learned from necessity rather than privilege, might see angles you'd miss. This is a circus, Victor sputtered. Patricia, surely you're not buying this fairy tale? Patricia looked at her tablet. Actually, Mr. Harlan, I've just received word that the SEC has opened an investigation into your Luxembourg subsidiaries based on the information Ms. Washington just provided. Would you care to comment? Victor's screen went black. He disconnected. The studio was quiet for a moment. Then Patricia turned back to the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the exposure of potential financial fraud, but the breaking of a different kind of illusion. The assumption that expertise can only come from expected sources. After the cameras stopped rolling, Naomi slumped in her chair, exhausted. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her shaky and drained. You were magnificent, Richard said softly. I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. Patricia Chin approached them. Ms. Washington, that was one of the most compelling interviews I've done in 20 years. The network wants to offer you a position as a financial analyst. Your perspective, your methods, they're unique. Naomi blinked, stunned. I need to think about it. As they left the studio, Richard's phone was exploding with messages. The board members who'd wanted him out were backtracking. Investors were calling to congratulate him on finding such an unusual talent. The narrative was shifting, but outside, they found Victor Harland waiting by his car, his face twisted with rage. "You think you've won?" he snarled at Naomi. "You're still just a maid playing dress-up. This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Richard said, stepping between them. "You're done, Victor, and you're beaten by someone you consider beneath notice. That's got to sting." Victor's hands clenched into fists, but his lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering urgently about the cameras still rolling from across the street. He got in his car, but not before giving Naomi one last venomous look. "He'll come after me," Naomi said quietly. "My history, my family, everything. Let him try," Richard replied. "You've got something he'll never have, the truth. And now you've got something else too." "What's that?" "A voice, and people ready to listen." That evening, Naomi returned to her apartment to find it filled with flowers. Not from admirers, but from other invisible people, janitors, security guards, food service workers, all saying the same thing. "Thank you for showing them we matter." Marcus was reading the messages, tears in his eyes. "Naomi, you're trending worldwide, but not the memes anymore. People are calling you a hero." "I'm not a hero," she said, hugging him. "I just did my job. All of it." Her phone rang. It was Eleanor Hastings. "Ms. Washington, I owe you an apology. The board would like to formally offer you the position of Chief Strategy Officer at Vale Enterprises. Your own office, a seven-figure salary, and the respect you've always deserved." Naomi looked around her small apartment, at the business books she'd studied by candlelight, at the notebook where she'd written her observations for years, at her brother's proud face. "I'll think about it," she said. "But if I accept, things change. No more invisible people at Vale Enterprises. Everyone gets seen, everyone gets heard. That's a big ask. That's the price of my visibility. Take it or leave it." Eleanor paused, then laughed. "You really are an exceptional negotiator. We'll discuss terms tomorrow." After she hung up, Naomi went to her window, looking out at the city lights. 24 hours ago, she'd been ready to disappear, to take the money and fade back into invisibility. Now, she was being offered everything she dreamed of. Her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. "Whatever you decide, I want you to know something. You didn't just save my company. You saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't have been able to live with. Thank you." She typed back, "We saved each other." And in a penthouse across the city, Richard Vale read those words and smiled, knowing that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones you never see coming. 3 days after the Bloomberg interview, Naomi Washington walked into Vale Enterprises through the main entrance for the first time. No service elevator, no uniform, just a simple business suit she'd bought with Richard's advance. The security guard who'd ignored her for 2 years did a double take, then smiled warmly. "Ms. Washington, saw you on TV. You were incredible." She thanked him, noting how visibility changed everything, except what really mattered. The emergency board meeting was in an hour, and she could feel the tension in the building like electricity before a storm. Richard met her at the executive elevator, his face grim. "We have a problem. Victor, worse. The board." The elevator rose in silence until Richard finally spoke. "They've called a vote of no confidence. Crawford's leading it. He says the publicity stunt, their words, has made us uninvestable. But the stock price is recovering. Not fast enough for them. And Victor's been working behind the scenes, promising them golden parachutes if they hand him the company." Naomi's mind raced. "He can't afford that. Not with the SEC investigation. He's got backing. Silent partners we didn't know about." Richard handed her a tablet showing financial documents. "This came in this morning. Victor's assembled a hostile takeover fund. $2 billion ready to deploy. From where? Shell companies we can't trace. Yet, they entered the boardroom to find it already full. The 12 board members sat like judges at a tribunal. William Crawford at the center, his face carved from stone. "Richard," Crawford began without preamble, "we've given you every opportunity to stabilize this situation. Instead, you've turned us into a reality show. The vote is scheduled for noon. You have 1 hour to convince us not to remove you. I don't need an hour, Richard said. I need 5 minutes. Naomi, she stood, feeling the weight of their skepticism. Patricia Thornton actually rolled her eyes. But Naomi had spent years reading rooms, and she saw something else beneath the hostility. Fear. You're not really upset about the publicity, Naomi said quietly. You're terrified because Victor Harland has something on each of you. The room went silent. Crawford's face darkened. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Washington. It's a pattern recognition. She pulled out her notebook, the same one she carried as a maid. Mr. Crawford, 3 months ago, your grandson was arrested for insider trading. The charges were mysteriously dropped. Mr. Morrison, your company's toxic waste lawsuit vanished overnight. Ms. Thornton, your husband's gambling debts to some very dangerous people suddenly disappeared. How dare you? Patricia started. I dare because I've been invisible in these rooms for 2 years. I've heard your phone calls, seen your emails when you forgot to lock your screens, watched you make deals you thought no one would notice. Naomi's voice remained calm, professional. Victor Harland solved all your problems. And now he owns you. Crawford stood up, his face purple. This is blackmail. No, Naomi corrected. This is leverage recognition. The same skill that exposed Victor's fraud can expose yours. But I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to free you. Richard watched, amazed, as Naomi laid out document after document. Evidence she'd gathered not in the past few days, but over months of careful observation. Victor's hostile takeover fund, she continued, is built on the same foundation as his European deal, fraud, shell companies, and stolen money. When the SEC finishes their investigation, anyone associated with him will be radioactive. Your only chance is to distance yourselves now. Even if that's true, Crawford said, his voice less certain, we vote in an hour. There's no time. There's time if you're brave enough to use it. Naomi pulled up her phone, showing contact. Eric Muller, the journalist who broke the Burndout story. He's waiting for my call. I can give him everything about Victor's network, including how he compromised this board. Or I can give him a different story. How Vale Enterprises board courageously stood against corruption. You're asking us to betray Victor based on your word? Patricia asked. I'm asking you to save yourselves based on facts. Naomi turned on the boardroom screen, displaying a web of financial connections she'd mapped out. This is Victor's true structure. 23 shell companies for offshore accounts and one very angry Russian oligarch who just discovered Victor's been stealing from him. The board members went pale. Morrison grabbed his phone, typing frantically. This is real. These account numbers, these are actual. Of course they're real, Naomi said. I don't deal in speculation. I deal in information. And the information says you have 43 minutes to decide whether you're Victor's accomplices or his victims. Crawford sank into his chair. If we support Richard, Victor will destroy us. Victor's going to be too busy trying to stay out of prison, Richard said, speaking for the first time in minutes. Naomi, show them the rest. She pulled out a folder marked confidential. 3 hours ago, the FBI raided Victor's home office. They're not just investigating financial fraud anymore. They're investigating money laundering for international crime syndicates. Anyone on his payroll, when the indictments come down, goes down with him. The room erupted in panic conversations. Board members were calling lawyers, assistants, anyone who could verify what Naomi was saying. Through it all, she stood calm at the center of the storm, a woman who'd gone from invisible to inevitable. Eleanor Hastings, who'd been quiet until now, stood up. I motioned to table the vote of no confidence indefinitely. Seconded, Morrison said quickly. All in favor? Crawford asked weakly. Every hand rose. Motion carried, Crawford said, then looked at Richard. You've got your company. For now. But this isn't over. No, Richard agreed. It's just beginning. Naomi, would you like to tell them the rest? She smiled, the first time she'd smiled in that boardroom. Mr. Harland is on his way here. He thinks he's coming to accept your surrender. Instead, he's walking into a trap. What kind of trap? Patricia asked. The kind where he confesses everything on camera, Naomi said. You see, I've learned something about powerful men like Victor. Their greatest weakness is their need to brag about how clever they are. All we have to do is give him the opportunity. 40 minutes later, Victor Harlan strode into the boardroom like a conquering emperor. His lawyers flanked him, documents ready for Richard's resignation and the transfer of power. He didn't notice the small camera Naomi had placed in the conference phone, or the way the board members avoided his eyes. "Richard," Victor said, his voice dripping satisfaction. "Ready to sign?" "Actually, Victor, I had a question first," Richard said casually. "How did you do it? How did you play everyone so perfectly?" Victor's ego couldn't resist. "It wasn't hard. You're all so predictable. Take Crawford here. One little favor for his grandson, and he's mine forever." Crawford's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "And the European deal?" Naomi asked from her seat in the corner, almost invisible again. "How long were you planning that?" Victor laughed. 18 months. I knew Burned Out would fail eventually. I just had to time it right. Make sure Richard was desperate enough to take the bait. "And the shell companies?" "Please," Victor scoffed. "Elementary financial engineering. You hide money in one place, move it through another, clean in a third. The FBI could investigate for years and never find anything solid." "What about the Russian money?" Naomi asked innocently. Victor's smile faltered slightly. "What Russian money?" "The $200 million from Dmitry Volkov's energy fund that you redirected through Luxembourg." The color drained from Victor's face. "How could you possibly?" "The same way I knew about Burned," Naomi said, standing up. "I pay attention. And so does the FBI agent who's been listening to this entire conversation." The boardroom door opened. Federal agents entered, badges visible, faces professional. The lead agent walked directly to Victor. "Victor Harlan, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent. This is entrapment," Victor shouted, looking wildly at his lawyers. "She set me up. The maid set me up." "The maid," Naomi said quietly, "outsmarted you, because you never thought to guard yourself against someone you considered beneath notice." As the agents cuffed Victor, he turned to Richard with pure hatred. "This isn't over. I have resources you can't imagine. I'll be out in hours." "Actually," the lead FBI agent said, "Mr. Volkov has frozen all your accounts and is cooperating fully with our investigation. Turns out he doesn't like being stolen from." They dragged Victor out, his screams echoing down the hallway. The boardroom sat in stunned silence until Crawford finally spoke. "Ms. Washington, how long have you been working with the FBI?" "Since yesterday," she replied. "When I realized Victor's fraud went beyond corporate crime into international money laundering, I made a call. They were very interested in what I had to share." Patricia Thornton laughed, actually laughed. "You played him. You played all of us." "I revealed the truth," Naomi corrected. "That's all I've ever done. The difference is, now people listen." Eleanor Hastings stood up. "I'd like to formally nominate Naomi Washington for the position of Chief Strategy Officer, effective immediately." "Seconded," Crawford said, his voice humble for the first time Naomi had ever heard. "All in favor?" This time, the vote was unanimous. 6 weeks later, the signing ceremony for the restructured European deal was held in the same St. Regis Hotel where Victor had fallen. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Media from around the world had gathered not to witness a corporate battle, but to see the conclusion of what Bloomberg had called the most dramatic corporate turnaround in modern history. Richard Vale stood at the podium, but beside him, equally prominent, stood Naomi Washington. She wore a designer suit now, a gift from a fashion house that wanted to dress the woman who'd become a symbol of overlooked brilliance. But on her lapel, she wore a small pin, a mop and bucket made of gold, a reminder of where she'd come from. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, 6 weeks ago, Vale Enterprises was on the brink of collapse. We were saved not by traditional thinking or conventional wisdom, but by someone who saw what others missed, who heard what others ignored, who understood that wisdom doesn't only come from corner offices. He turned to Naomi. "Ms. Washington, would you like to explain the new deal structure?" Naomi stepped to the microphone, no longer nervous about public speaking. She'd done dozens of interviews, spoken at conferences, even testified before Congress about corporate fraud detection. But this moment felt different. This was the completion of a journey that had started in a penthouse kitchen, listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. The new European partnership is built on transparency, she began, her voice clear and confident. Every supplier is verified, every transaction traceable, every promise backed by substance rather than speculation. We've reduced the deal value from $23 billion to $14 billion, but the real value, the sustainable, honest value, is actually higher. A reporter raised her hand. Ms. Washington, Victor Harland claimed you manipulated this situation for personal gain. How do you respond? Victor Harland is currently facing 47 federal charges and has been denied bail, Naomi replied calmly. I think his credibility speaks for itself. But to answer your question, I gained something invaluable from the situation. A voice. And I've used that voice not just for personal gain, but to change how Vale Enterprises operates. She clicked a remote, bringing up a presentation. We've implemented what we call the Invisible Initiative. Every employee, regardless of position, can submit strategic insights and business intelligence. The janitor who notices supply chain inefficiencies, the security guard who observes suspicious patterns, the food service worker who overhears crucial information. They all have a direct line to senior management. And it's working, Richard added. In 6 weeks, we've identified $12 million in savings and 3 potential security breaches, all from employees who were previously considered invisible. Another reporter called out, Mr. Vale, what's your relationship with Ms. Washington now? There have been rumors. We're partners, Richard said simply. Business partners, strategic partners, and I'd like to think friends. Naomi Washington saved my company, but more importantly, she changed my perspective. I spent 30 years believing that power came from position. She taught me it comes from perception, the ability to see clearly without ego or prejudice. After the signing, the celebration moved to Vale Enterprises headquarters. The building was transformed, not just physically but culturally. The service elevators had been opened to all staff. The executive floor now included a workspace where any employee could reserve time to present ideas. The invisible had become visible. Marcus was there, wearing his first suit, having just been accepted to NYU's business school with a full scholarship funded by a new program Naomi had established. He hugged his sister tightly. Mom would be so proud, he whispered. She always was, Naomi replied. We just had to prove to the world what she already knew. Eleanor Hastings approached with a champagne glass. Naomi, I've been on 30 boards in my career. I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished. You didn't just save a company. You've changed how business thinks about talent and intelligence. I had help, Naomi said, nodding toward Richard, who was talking to employees he'd never noticed before, maintenance staff, security guards, cafeteria workers. He was listening to them, really listening, taking notes on their ideas. He's different, Eleanor observed. You changed him. We changed each other. That's what good partnerships do. The celebration continued into the evening, but Naomi stepped away for a moment of quiet. She found herself in Richard's office, the same room where she'd first revealed her knowledge, where everything had changed. The city sparkled below, lights stretching to the horizon. Richard found her there, hiding from your own party. Reflecting, she corrected. 6 weeks ago, I was nobody. Now, you were never nobody, Richard interrupted. You were unrecognized. There's a difference. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city. Finally, Richard spoke again. I've been thinking about what's next. Vale Enterprises is stable. The European deal is signed. Victor's going to prison. We could coast now, play it safe. But safe isn't what got us here. I want to do something different. A venture fund. Maybe investing in overlooked talent, unconventional thinkers, people who clean up messes while building empires in their minds. Naomi suggested with a smile. Exactly. Partners. Naomi considered. 6 weeks ago, she'd been fighting for survival, for recognition, for a chance to be heard. Now she was being offered the opportunity to ensure others wouldn't have to fight as hard. One condition, she said. We call it the Visible Fund. And our first investment goes to a scholarship program for children of service workers. Done. Richard extended his hand. Partners. She shook it. Partners. As the party continued below, they went over initial plans, ideas flowing between them with the ease of true collaboration. No longer the billionaire and the maid, but two minds that had found respect and synergy in the most unlikely circumstances. A knock at the door interrupted them. James, Richard's assistant, entered with an iPad. Sir, Ms. Washington, you need to see this. On the screen was breaking news. Victor Harland attempts suicide in federal custody. Condition critical. The room went quiet. Naomi felt a complex mix of emotions. Not satisfaction, not guilt, just a deep sadness at how far pride could make someone fall. He left a note. James continued. It says, I was destroyed by someone I never saw coming. Remember that the invisible ones are watching. Richard looked at Naomi. How do you feel about that? She thought for a long moment. I feel responsible, not for his choices, but for ensuring that what happened here means something, that it changes things. It already has, Richard said, gesturing to the party below where executives and janitors mingled as equals. Look at them. 6 weeks ago, they existed in different worlds. Now, they're collaborating. Naomi's phone buzzed. It was a text from Patricia Chun at Bloomberg. Just got word. You've been nominated for Business Person of the Year. The maid who saved an empire and changed corporate America. Congratulations. She showed it to Richard, who smiled. You deserve it. We deserve it, she corrected. You had the courage to listen when everyone told you not to. That matters. The party was winding down when Crawford approached them. The man who'd been ready to destroy them both 6 weeks ago now looked humbled, aged. Ms. Washington, he said formally, I owe you an apology and a debt. You could have destroyed me with what you knew. Instead, you gave me a chance to make things right. Everyone deserves a second chance, Mr. Crawford, even billionaires who've lost their way. He smiled slightly. I'm retiring from the board. But before I go, I want you to know something. In 40 years of business, you're the most formidable strategist I've ever encountered. And you did it all while the rest of us weren't even looking. After he left, Naomi and Richard stood at the window one last time. The city below was alive with possibility. Millions of stories unfolding. Countless invisible people with brilliant minds waiting to be recognized. What are you thinking? Richard asked. I'm thinking about all the Naomi Washingtons out there, she replied. The security guards with engineering degrees, the food service workers with coding skills, the janitors with solutions to problems their bosses don't even know exist. We'll find them, Richard promised. The Visible Fund will change that. It's a start, Naomi agreed. Then, looking at her reflection in the window, no longer in a maid's uniform, but still fundamentally herself, she added, You know what the real turnaround was? Not the company, not the stock price. It was the moment you stopped seeing me as just a maid and started seeing me as a mind. And the moment you stopped seeing me as just another arrogant billionaire and saw someone capable of change, Richard replied. They stood there as equals, partners, friends, proof that sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not in boardrooms or battlefields, but in the simple act of seeing people for who they really are. The next morning's headlines would scream about the European deal, about Vale Enterprises' remarkable recovery, about Victor Harland's downfall. But the real story, the one that would ripple through corporate America for years to come, was simpler. A maid had been listening, a billionaire had learned to hear, and together they'd proven that brilliance exists everywhere, waiting to be recognized. Naomi Washington had begun this journey invisible, cleaning up after the powerful, while her mind dissected their empires. She ended it standing in the spotlight, but she carried with her every lesson learned in the shadows. The notebook she'd filled as a maid now sat on her executive desk, a reminder that the most powerful position isn't always at the head of the table. Sometimes it's in the corner of the room, watching, learning, waiting for the moment when the invisible becomes undeniable. As she looked out at the city one last time before heading home to Marcus, to their small apartment that they'd soon leave for something better, but never forget, Naomi whispered the words she'd said months ago, but with a different meaning now. invisible no more. And in that moment, across the city, in break rooms and supply closets, in security booths and cleaning carts, other invisible people heard about Naomi Washington's story. They pulled out their own notebooks, their own observations, their own brilliant ideas that no one had ever asked to hear. The revolution had begun. So here's my question for you. How many brilliant minds have you walked past today without seeing them? And what revolutions are we missing because we only look for wisdom in the expected places? If this story made you think differently about who deserves to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge everything we think we know about power, brilliance, and invisible people who might just save us all.